Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IGTV. This is a production in New York City InfraGard Members Alliance. And with us this morning, we've got Mark Kapperzin. And Mark is going to deliver InfraGard insights into better practices for access control lists and rule sets. Mark, take it away.
Good morning, Joe. This morning, talking about some good practices around access control lists and rule sets in our security infrastructures, especially in IT. There are a variety of products and platforms and things that we need to secure, and that's typically done with some level of access control. A lot of these things come with access control lists or rule sets, and I want to walk through not only looking at each one individually, but trying to start putting the pieces together so that you take a holistic approach to, defense and layers. And, in some ways you want covering controls, in other ways you want to make sure that you're getting the most cost-effective security for your dollars spent. Quickly, the category of most of these access control mechanisms these days with commercial products is role-based access control, RBAC. And that's typically, it's a non-discretionary policy. It's set at the system level, so you have an administrator or some other entity that goes in and configures the rules. Very popular with commercial applications. You're starting to see it adopted in military systems as well. And, it provides you a multi-level security. And so there are three primary rules. You've got role assignment, which is, generating an entity for a role, and you've got role authorization. What is that role allowed to do? And you have some level of transaction authentication, and that determines what level of authorization each of those roles can do within the structure of the thing you're dealing with. I would say rule sets are kind of a follow-on to access control lists, and we see them mostly in firewalls and routers. However, there are other things that, start to look like, security event management systems have rule sets, and typically what they are is they're a set of nested access control rules, if you will. So you will have a list of conditions, programmers would refer them as, nested if then else or go-tos, and you basically flow down the logic to come up with what a particular set of transactions or communications is allowed to do based on how it falls through the rules. So looking at the high level, typically when we're dealing with access control, it's either going to be people, group, rights-based for file access, or it might address, IP address, host, service, protocol, sorts of things. So, in the ACL world, where we typically looking at Active Directory, LDAP, database, rule sets, what do you need to be worried about? Your perimeter firewall and routers, the main thing that have rule sets that you want to pay attention to. And as well, internal transition points. So between your network zones inside, you want to look at those as well as your VLAN composition, which is pretty critical. And if you have security alerting systems, VPN, if you're doing anything at the host interface and the network interface card in your hosts, those are the things you need to look at. So going back to defense and layers, understand what rules are engaged at what layer of defense. If you have, firewalls, then, routers going out to the internet, it's possible to be blocking the same thing with different devices. And sometimes that may be good, sometimes that may be bad. If you're blocking FTP at both the firewall and the router, you're getting double the protection, but are you paying a performance price for it? So you need to pay attention to optimize that and figure out what is going to give you the best cost-effective solution in terms of if the router performance degrades significantly and it's a high-traffic router, maybe you want to put more rules in your firewall. Or you may want to balance the load a little bit, and if you know that there's protocols that you want to just drop at the router, put that in the router, and if you have complex firewall rules that you need to ensure good performance around, move some of that smart load up to the firewall. And again, getting back into, well, where does the firewall rules have to do with some of these other ACLs out in my infrastructure? If the firewall is dependent on your LDAP for certain rights and rules, you're going to need to pay attention to how your LDAP is configured, how your Active Directory entities are configured, what rights they have, and what those ACLs look like. and work to make sure that they're properly meshed with your firewall rules. Again, going back to, least privilege, business purposes only allow services that are required to support the business function, and understand that in some cases care and feeding of your IT systems are a business function. So going into from there to best practices, make sure you follow least privilege. So only the things that need to communicate. Do the rules and access controls reflect your security policy and your information classification? Typically, again, this is where something comes in, you pull it out of the box, you've got a recommended vendor configuration, and you slam it in because you need to get it going. But at some point, you need to take a look at it and say, do those rules, do those ACLs map to my business requirements? And do they map to my information classification? So you need to understand how particular solutions logic works with that too, because you need to, in firewalls, there's typically a, deny all rule, and sometimes you need to put that first and then allow exceptions to that, and in some cases you need to put all your logic first and use that as the last rule, and you need to understand your vendor and your product to understand how that logic works and how to apply it. Moving into some of the other things, again, change the default passwords and settings and names. Some of these things come with vendor passwords, vendor names, and then, you don't want to leave that default up. So if there's a default rule for a certain protocol and it's named that by Check Point or Cisco, change the rule, change the administrator name and password where you can. And then getting back into your own infrastructure, understand and know your critical IP addresses, your critical host and DNS names, your critical groups and other entities. Their appearance in the rules and the ACLs when you're inspecting these things should be a reflection of the level of protection required. So you should see all your critical elements that you do information asset assessments on reflected in the rules and your various security platforms. And when you're creating these things, make sure that you group like things together in the rules and ACLs. If you have a series, and that can apply to both entities and objects as well as logic. If you have a bunch of services listed, it's like deny FTP, deny the IGP, deny ICMP. Make sure all that's put together so that when you're inspecting and you're doing an audit of these things, you can very easily see what's covered where, so you're not having to jump to the beginning of the rules to the end of the rules, unless there's a operational reason you need to do that. And if you can test and validate these rules without endangering operational quality of service, make sure you do at regular intervals. And lastly, I want to talk about change management, because that's something that's really critical in all of this. Make sure you have a documented process for adding rules and entities. And as you add the rules and entities, make sure that stuff gets documented. As you're changing the rules, make sure you document the rules. And that also applies when you're deleting rules and entities. If you have employees leaving the company, or you change business systems, make sure you have a good retirement process, and you can follow that through to make sure things aren't cluttering up your firewall rules, so you're not doing an archaeological dig every time you have to change something. Review to see what has been used. FTP may not be used, and you may not have blocked that, not only within your organization but looking outside. But other things may rarely be used, but you need to allow it in case you do need them. And again, that's going to go back into your business requirements. It's typically recommended by SANS and NIST to do a twice annual review of rule sets and ACLs against a requirement and your current as-built. As you retire services and technology, do you reflect that in the rules? If you got rid of a bunch of older platforms that used a different type of database service, you need to not only add the new database service that you just built, but you need to take out the old database that you just took out. So you don't need those protocols anymore. Unused services, entities, groups should be disabled first and then deleted after an acceptable change window. And that's pretty much the insight on ACLs and rule sets. I'll have some more documents from SANS and NIST up in a few minutes on the chat window, and it's back to you, Joe.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. Just for your information, Mark, it looks like we lost the stream about halfway through, and I didn't want to interrupt you